Chapter 33. The creature roared as the ground shook. Waving tendrils emerged from the archdemon's back as it raised its hand and launched a flurry of fireballs. Victor's golden shield deflected the attacks aimed at him, but the heat melted the ice around him, and he slipped down into a pool of icy slush. Victor leapt to his feet and spun around to slash at the monster, but it seemed to anticipate his movements. "It has the ability to see the future," whispered Victor to himself. He blinked his glowing eyes and saw the archdemon rushing toward him with his horns and fangs exposed. Victor leapt back, but suddenly realized that he had seen his own vision of the future as the archdemon rushed toward him. Victor rushed with his sword up and swung it hard. The archdemon spun back and roared in his face. Victor suddenly became aware that the ice on which his opponent stood was weak. Victor smiled and stabbed the ground, causing the archdemon to slide down into an icy pit. Victor rushed in to follow up, but was pushed back as a dozen large fireballs came from the archdemon's hand. Victor tried to deflect them with his shield so they would hit his enemy, but the force was too great for him to accurately redirect, and he was thrown back into the air. As he was flying away, he suddenly felt his arms being pulled back, making his body vulnerable. He realized he was not in control of his body. Instantly, Victor found himself in the blue mind realm. Hundreds of tendrils from the archdemon's back had wrapped around Victor's arms and were trying to tear him apart. The power that William Fine had used to manipulate others was now in the hands of its master. Victor gripped his sword, which exploded with fire. The archdemon roared and retreated, pulling its burning tendrils back. In the literal realm, the archdemon used incredible speed to suddenly rush around Victor and slash at his leg. The abilities that had made Felix so difficult to fight were even more impressive as the hulking archdemon rushed at him. Blood sprayed out from the lacerations as Victor flew through the air. He closed his eyes, and using his heaven's breath power, the lacerations glowed and closed up. A vision of the archdemon rushing with his demon speed came to Victor's mind, and he used his teleportation ability to appear over his enemy's head and plunge his burning blade into the archdemon's skull. "It's over," shouted Victor. "You're defeated." The archdemon thrashed around, throwing Victor and his sword free. Blood oozed out of the massive puncture in the creature's head. It roared loudly and thrashed about, causing the ground to shake again. Victor got to his feet to watch the result of his triumph. The stars in the sky had been easily visible earlier, but Victor suddenly noticed dark clouds swirling about them overhead. He turned back to the archdemon to see that the deadly wound he had inflicted was being healed as dark energies flowed through the creature. "How is this possible?" asked Victor. "That wasn't one of the abilities of the demon lords." As the words left his lips, he recalled that Catherine Page had a gift for reviving the dead, and that his enemy was reviving itself using this ability. The idea of battling an opponent that could not die made Victor shudder. His own Heaven's Breath key had impressive healing as well, and it was possible that he had found himself in a stalemate. "How do I defeat it?" asked Victor. As if to answer that it was impossible, the archdemon roared at Victor, then launched a barrage of fireballs. Victor teleported out of their path, only to be smashed by an incredibly fast charge attack. As he slid across the ice, his own injuries seemed to heal. Suddenly, he wondered if that was the sacrifice he and his friends had been asked to make. If he was expected to be locked in an eternal battle with a monstrous demon where neither of them would die. A barrage of firebolts eroded the ice onto which Victor was falling, leaving sharp and jagged ground below him. He again teleported above the archdemon with his sword prepared to impale the beast, but this time Victor was grabbed by a tendril and hurled away. Victor decided that against the archdemon's speed, teleportation was the best counter. He blinked himself all around the archdemon as he swung his fiery sword. The beast roared as its body became covered with agonizing shallow cuts. It crouched down and exploded with a ring of fire that caught Victor off guard and threw him into a heap of acolyte corpses. He shuddered with disgust as he teleported away from the foul-smelling cadavers. Realizing that his previous effort had made the archdemon angry, he decided to repeat his teleportation flurry attack. Blinking all around the archdemon, he sliced into its horn-covered body. The tentacles that had been flailing about seemed to retreat into the archdemon's back as it roared loudly. Again the creature crouched and prepared to unleash a fiery blast, but this time Victor's shield was ready. The ring of flames failed to push Victor back, and he continued his teleportation flurry attack. Triumph seemed to grow closer as Victor sliced through horns and carapace, only to blink above or to another side and slice again. A smile appeared on his face as he raised his golden shield and deflected another wave of flames. Dark fluid oozed out of the sliced flesh of Victor's opponent. As Victor continued slashing, the blood of the beast spattered out onto the melting ice around. The waves of flame had created a deeper crater in the ice. The cold ambient temperatures were quick to freeze the water and created a slick bowl-like arena where Michael's champion battled the archdemon. The creature howled in agony as Victor increased the rate of his teleportation flurry attack. As fast as the archdemon was healing itself, its flesh was being flayed. Victor decided it was time to increase the force of his attacks to see if he could hew his opponent into oblivion. With its foresight ability, the archdemon knew what Victor was planning. In a desperate move using an incredible burst of speed, the monster sped away from the crater it had created. Its clawed feet provided traction as it raced up the slick slope. Victor crouched on the frozen ground and took a moment to recover his own strength. His breath formed small visible puffs in the freezing air. He clenched his teeth and decided to go after the archdemon again when he suddenly froze in horror. He realized that the tentacles that had emerged from the archdemon's back had latched onto several corpses. It was similar to the tubes that had connected people in the mountain caverns. Energy was flowing through the tendrils either toward or away from the bodies at ends with a dark pulsing light. Some of the corpses to which he was attached seemed to deteriorate quickly, while two of the others began growing claws and horns. Victor gasped in shock. The archdemon was making destroyers to aid him. Victor teleported up to the archdemon, hoping to cut the beast up again before it could finish its task. No sooner had he arrived than a pair of cutting beams emerged from the hands of the destroyers. Victor's golden shield expanded to protect him from the beams, but he was unprepared for the massive stream of flames from the archdemon's hands. Victor was thrown back into the crater, and as he slid down, he realized that his battle was about to become far more difficult. The two destroyers rushed to the edge of the crater and began firing cutting beams toward Victor. He groaned as one of them pierced his leg. His shield expanded to cover him as his healing ability closed the wound. He teleported back up to try and attack the archdemon, but his opponents anticipated his movements and hit him again with a combination of fire and cutting attacks. Victor shouted in pain as he put his shield up. One of the destroyers pressed its clawed fingers against the ground to send a death attack at Victor. Sensing his peril, Victor teleported to the other side of the destroyer with his shield up around him like a bubble. Flames and cutting beams hit the golden sphere as soon as Victor had appeared. He sighed with a bit of relief. Heaven's shield and Heaven's breath provided him some security against these powerful enemies. Unfortunately, the archdemon sensed Victor's moment of relief and used a mind realm attack to force him to drop his shield. In the mind realm, Victor raced to attack the beast with hundreds of swarming tentacles that were pulling at his arms and legs. In the literal realm, a cutting beam tore a hole in his gut. Blood poured out of the new hole in Victor's stomach, creating a long stain on his clothing and a growing puddle on the ground. The destroyers laughed with glee as they continued punching holes in his body. It was at that moment Victor recognized the destroyer bodies. The archdemon had used the bodies of Jonathan and Kirana to create his destroyers. "No!" screamed Victor. This revelation brought tears to his eyes. The bodies of his friends had been profaned. His allies were surrounded in dark fire and had become puppets of the archdemon. "These humans were important to you," said the destroyers in unison. Their voices were low and echoed unnaturally, but Victor could see through them. He was finally able to cut through the swarm of tentacles that had slowed him in the mind realm and bring up a golden shield to protect himself while his Heaven's Breath ability began the painful process of mending the holes that had been burned into his body. He teleported down into the ice cavern from which the archdemon had emerged. This move had been more instinctual than strategic, as he knew that the archdemon could tell where he had gone, and a pair of cutting beams quickly began pressuring the integrity of his heavenly shield. It at least gave him an opportunity to suppress the shock and pain he felt from seeing his friends turned into pawns of the creature they had sacrificed their lives to stop. As his wounds closed, Victor was able to perceive the archdemon using his tentacles to create a new pair of destroyers in addition to the two that were already fighting him. "Not good," whispered Victor as he gasped for breath. Knowing that they would be able to predict his movements, Victor teleported around to try and use offense as a shield. He hoped he might at least be able to prevent additional destroyers from being made. He focused on his own predictive abilities to avoid the cutting beams that came from his opponents as he made another attempt to strike the archdemon. The result of his endeavor was worse than he had anticipated. The archdemon endured Victor's powerful slices in order to focus on gaining mind control over Victor. Immobilized, he watched helplessly as a short destroyer in Lucas's body approached on one side, and a massive destroyer in Sig's body approached on the other. "Come now, Michael," taunted all four destroyers in unison. The sound of their voices filled Victor with fear. "Is this any way to greet your friends?" His four destroyers then roared with sadistic pleasure as they cut holes in Victor's body again. It took about 60 seconds for Victor to break free of the archdemon puppeteer technique. He immediately teleported out of reach of additional tendrils from the archdemon and began healing himself. He groaned, partly from the agony of nerves and organs being weaved together again, and partly from knowing that a new pair of destroyers would be waiting for him the moment he got close. He obviously would need to find a new approach. His mind raced over what he knew about his opponents and his environment to see if he could leverage something. He would not be able to trap anyone in the ice, as the cutting beams of the destroyers would eliminate such obstacles. The archdemon did not seem to have a problem in the presence or absence of light the way that Felix had, even if he had been able to reduce the glow of his shining raiment. The cold did not seem to slow any of his opponents down, and the archdemon was able to produce fire on its body, so Victor decided that heat might not help him. He clenched his teeth in frustration. The sound of footsteps crunching snow echoed across the frozen earth. The foul breath of Victor's opponents puffed up in small clouds that fell around themselves like mushrooms. For an instant, Victor's thoughts returned to the moments at Philip's Italian restaurant when he and Jennifer had enjoyed flavorful mushrooms with their pasta. Of course, Jennifer was gone now. She had been murdered by the demon lords. She had spent her last breaths trying to buy time for Victor to be successful, and he felt ashamed that he was not prevailing. He looked up to see the small destroyer. At first he felt angry, but he forced himself to calm down and think. What would Lucas do? Whispered Victor to himself. Lucas had been uncharacteristically surprised by Sarah Hawkins. He was almost always at least one step ahead of any opponent with which they had battled, but in the final moments, there were too many variables. Perhaps the others had relied upon him too much to arrange for transportation to Antarctica. Perhaps the emotions that came with seeing friends fall was more than he had been able to bear. Suddenly Victor realized that something was happening and broke his focus and spun toward his opponents. Row 82 and Jennifer had been transformed into destroyers. He clenched his teeth angrily. "Not her," he whispered. "Not Jennifer." He furrowed his brow with renewed determination. He could not allow his friends to be used. He stood tall and held his shining golden shield up as 6 cutting beams targeted him. In the blink of an eye, he teleported near the destroyers and swung his sword around. The archdemon cautiously approached to try and ensnare Victor in his mind control, but Victor teleported away. In a flurry of teleports, Victor blinked all over the battlefield. The Kirana destroyer cut through the Jonathan destroyer with its beam, causing the archdemon to roar angrily. Seizing the opportunity, Victor teleported to the area where his friends had made their last stand. A pack with dozens of grenades sat on the ground near the Row 82 destroyer. Before the augment had died, he had been throwing these grenades at acolytes. Victor scooped up the pack and teleported away. In a carefully executed sequence of teleports, Victor pulled the pins in the grenades and dropped them near each of his remaining opponents. "Don't hurt us, Michael," pled the destroyers in unison. Victor clenched his fists and ignored the mind games that the archdemon was playing with him. The explosions launched the destroyers into the air. In the confusion, the archdemon whirled around to see Victor standing behind him. As he swung Heaven's sword, it lit up with a blinding light, and the hand of the archdemon flew off. The sword grew even brighter as Victor swung and cut off a leg. The archdemon began to roar and reach toward his destroyers. The bodies of Victor's friends rushed toward him like dogs to their owner. As they drew close, he grabbed them with his tentacles and emitted a ring of fire that threw Victor back before he could slice off the last leg of the archdemon. Victor struggled back to his feet and watched in horror as the archdemon drained his destroyers and regenerated himself with the power of their sacrifice. He closed his eyes, hoping to slow time as Jennifer had done. He teleported next to the archdemon to attempt to slice through the tentacles, but a dark energy deflected his sword and threw him back. "Stop it!" screamed Victor. Not only had the archdemon used his friends to attack Victor, it had forced him to relive their deaths. Time zipped back to its normal pace as the archdemon pulled itself up. It exploded with dark fire, and Victor only barely prevented being ripped apart by this new energy using his golden shield. The archdemon roared and turned to Victor. Victor shuddered. The sacrifices the archdemon had made had increased his powers tremendously. "You monster!" shouted Victor. His voice sounded as helpless as it did angry. He felt like some of the slave children he had seen before he had found any divine keys. Though they would occasionally try to fight back, it never ended well for them. In an instant, Victor was pulled into the air. To an observer, it would have appeared that the archdemon had telekinetic powers, but the truth was that its mind realm puppeteer powers had been greatly augmented. Victor entered the mind realm to try to break free, but to his horror, his sword could no longer cut through the tendrils of his enemy. He tried to focus, but the archdemon pulled his arms and legs apart, preparing to rip Victor in half. Victor screamed as his muscles and bones were pulled away from each other. He tried to teleport away, but it seemed that all of his powers were being suppressed by the strength of the archdemon's dark sacrificial aura. It made a noise that seemed like it was laughing with sadistic pleasure as Victor closed his eyes and tried to force himself to focus on what he could do. His origin powers gave him a quick glimpse at how the archdemon had derived his power through repeated sacrifices of others. Victor decided that was of no use. His perception powers only reminded him of how much agony he felt. A glimpse at possible futures seemed to show him being ripped apart and the archdemon taking over everything. He was in no position to use his sword or his shield, and his healing ability was probably the only thing that prevented him from being ripped apart, and Victor could tell it would not last. The soul key and the teleportation key powers seemed to be dampened by the influence of the archdemon. He desperately tried to time travel to escape, but found that he could only slow time down. Suddenly, as if offering help, the key of origins began glowing and showed him a vision. Lucas stood next to him. "Lucas," cried Victor, "what do I do?" Silently, Lucas pointed to a scene behind him and seemed to dissolve away. Victor recognized it immediately. It was Ben Smith attacking the fire demon acolytes on the shores of the lake near the eastern shrine. He had used the power of sacrifice in their dark keys against them. Victor had forgotten that he could do anything with the 10th key before he had defeated the archdemon. He had hoped that he could seal his change to the timeline at that point. The memory of his vision with Ben Smith suddenly brought a new question to mind, though. If Ben had been able to strip the demon keys of the power of their sacrifice, and Michael had forged the divine keys, why had Michael not been able to defeat the archdemon initially? Why had he not simply taken away the power of sacrifices? Humanity is not prepared to produce such a council. Michael's words to Molly came rushing back to his mind. What was different now? Why even have someone chosen to bear the 10th key without really preparing them to use it? Victor wondered if he had been too eager to start this battle. "Victor," came a voice within his mind. He turned around. Michael stood before him. "This is the task for which you were chosen." "Why did someone need to be chosen to begin with?" asked Victor. "Why didn't you just defeat the archdemon?" "I could not fall far enough," said Michael. Victor tilted his head and squinted his eyes at the cryptic response. Only a human was capable of paying the price. "Sacrificing yourself was not good enough?" asked Victor. "What am I supposed to do that you could not?" "I am only myself," said Michael. "But in you, the will of your friends lives on. In you, the will of your parents thrives. In you exist the pleas of the entire human race. Being born of a fallen world, you are able to do something that I never could." "What?" asked Victor. "Truly channel the power of sacrifice," said Michael. The archangel seemed to fade away, but the vision did not end. Instead, he was taken back in his mind to see his friends falling again. Each of them fought as long as they were able to give him a chance to complete the attunement. He was taken back to his parents and witnessed their final moments as they gave their lives for him to escape. He realized that even though he had felt alone for much of his life, he had been given gifts by those who had gone before him. Though he had felt the bitter pain of solitude and loss, he realized that the pain of being without his loved ones had also come with power. Ben Smith had been able to access the power of the 10th key after the loss of his wife. He had been put on the path for the same key after the loss of his parents. He had been given the power of heaven's breath only after the betrayal of Daniel Young, and the perceived loss of Jennifer Cedar had shown him how to access the time key. The loss of his other friends in an alternate timeline to the cruelty of Felix Light had given him power to go back and save them. As bitter as the pain had been of discovering his friends had sacrificed themselves to purchase the time he needed for attunement, he realized that this pain was the difference between what he could do and what the Archangel had been able to do those many years before. This was what he meant by falling. The loss of those he loved was a nearly unbearable burden, but it was also the catalyst to unlocking hidden divine power. His pain intensified as his vision ended. He ignored the excruciating torture and looked toward the archdemon. He groaned as he thought about how everyone had been counting on him, and now he was being torn apart. Though he had made mistakes, and though he had suffered, the despair that came over him seemed more painful than the snapping of his tendons and tearing of his ligaments as he was being slowly stretched apart. He wanted his torment to end, but it seemed to go on. The epiphany that had come to him about the power of enduring loss seemed as though it were about to be swallowed by reality. Death drew closer with every passing moment, and Victor felt like an animal being stalked by an unseen predator. "Jennifer," whispered Victor, "I'm so sorry." Tears ran down his cheeks. He groaned in pain as his body popped in several places. The forces holding him together had nearly been defeated. He slipped again into vision and saw the earth being ripped apart by the archdemon. He felt very much like the planet that was being pulled into pieces as his arms pulled away from his body. He looked at the planet and saw thousands of people screaming in horror. "Is this the end?" whispered Victor. He was exhausted. "Do you want it to be?" came Michael's voice in response. "Do I have a choice?" whispered Victor as everything grew darker. "I was not strong enough." "Are you willing to be?" asked Michael. The echoes of screams seemed to fade, and the pain that racked Victor's body seemed to dull. He could tell that he was nearly dead. He focused on Jennifer. The memory of her beautiful golden hair and deep blue eyes seemed to dull the pain further. He wondered if there was an afterlife, and if he might be in it with her. Suddenly, the mental image of Jennifer smiling and peaceful turned to one with her frightened and starved. "Is this your choice?" whispered Michael's voice softly. He remembered that Jennifer had come from a time after the archdemon had attacked. His inability to stop the archdemon sealed her fate. She and all humanity would be relegated to living under the oppression of a monster that bred and sacrificed them for his own pleasure. "Stop!" screamed Victor in a hoarse voice. "Wait! No! Come back, Michael!" "What?" whispered Michael's voice. "I am willing!" screamed Victor as tears poured down his cheeks. The pain that had been dulling suddenly came back with excruciating sharpness. "I can endure. I will do what it takes." There was no answer. The silence seemed to amplify Victor's torment. "Please, Michael," pled Victor. "If you were the one that chose me, help me know what to do. If it is possible to redeem humanity, I want to do it." The silence lasted another excruciating minute. "It is enough," whispered Michael. Suddenly the pain in Victor's body ceased. The bones that had snapped as the archdemon had tried to pull him apart mended, and the ligaments, tendons, and blood vessels weaved back together. "You have become the master of sacrifice," said Michael. "Make the change, and then convince time to let it stand." Michael's voice disappeared entirely after his cryptic instructions, and Victor became aware of the monstrous creature that seemed to be frustrated that Victor was not torn asunder. A great swell of rage filled Victor's heart. "Your power over sacrifice is at an end," thundered Victor. The archdemon roared angrily, but then stopped. Victor noticed that the pain in his body had completely disappeared. Instantly, he sliced through the tentacles in the mind realm. He fell to the ground as the archdemon staggered back. "You have no strength but that which you have stolen," said Victor in a hoarse whisper as he got back up. The archdemon raised its hand and launched a series of progressively smaller fireballs. It stopped and looked at its clawed hand in disbelief, then turned to see Victor again get to his feet. Wind rushed tightly around Victor, tossing his dark hair about as the divine keys shone in the darkness. His coat shined with a surreal light and fluttered in the wind as he slowly approached the archdemon. The 10th key glowed blindingly bright, along with Victor's eyes. "You are a lie," accused Victor. "The demon lords feared you because they borrowed power that was not theirs. But you are no different than them." The archdemon rushed at Victor, but the impressive demonic speed had been reduced. "You believed that you could be strong because you accumulated power," said Victor as his eyes glowed. "But my friends generated power. In fact, all humanity creates power. You need us. But we no longer need you." The archdemon stumbled back as the horns on its body began to shrivel. Its fangs began to rot away. Victor teleported behind the archdemon to block its attempt to flee. The archdemon, which now looked more like an imp, stumbled in surprise. It could no longer see the future. Victor raised Heaven's sword into the air, and it expanded to become the size of a plane. In a swift motion, Victor swung. The archdemon's body fell in 2 pieces onto the frozen ground. In its last desperate moments, the scaly creature tried to heal itself, only to find that the final remnants of its power were gone. Victor breathed deeply, satisfied that the will of the Archangel had been fulfilled, and that Earth now had a chance to live free of demon power. Of course, Victor had forgotten that by significantly changing history, he would now have to fight against the pressures of time and destiny to ensure that his changes remained. His body began to glow, and excruciating pain that felt like thousands of knives flaying his flesh forced him to his knees. He tried to keep his eyes open, but it was only another moment before everything faded into darkness.